Hello, here we are again. It's Wednesday, and you know it's raining. Wow, what a change. What a change. Not raining hard, mind you. If it was raining hard, you'd hardly be able to hear me speak through the skylight above. So, I have a new phone now. It's exactly the same as the old phone. That's how adventurous I am. I decided I liked the old phone, and so I would buy another one exactly the same to replace the one with the shattered corner. My husband's going to try and stick a new screen on the other one. He seems massively confident about it, which I find surprising, given that the YouTube video of the expert doing it, the guy cracks it, and my husband similarly replaced the screen on one of our son's tablets, and in the process of replacing it also cracked it. So where the confidence comes from, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, he can replace the screen on the old one. If he can make it work, that would be lovely, because we hate throwing things away and we always try and reuse stuff. But I thought, while I wait, I'm going to get another phone, because it could be a bit of a wait. I was also fiddling around. One of the reasons I'm very slightly late is that I was fiddling around because I found that under the photo settings it seems to say something about selfie mirror, and I thought it might stop this doing this. Only whichever way I switch it on or off, it still looks the same, so that's obviously not what that setting does. Never mind. We're on chapter 3, and Joe has gone back to the house with this man who rescued him in the street, who does fortunately turn out to be William Lucas. And although Joe is terrified initially that Lucy doesn't seem to be there, maybe there is no Lucy, then he does meet her again. Although, of course, she doesn't recognise him. She never recognises him. This is always a problem for him. So he's also been attacked by the monkey Solomon, if you remember, who's a macaque. Quite a small monkey, long tail, quite commonly kept as a domesticated pet in Tudor times. Not Tudor times. Well, from Tudor times onwards. This is later than Tudors. We're into Restoration England here. But yes, in the old days, it wasn't that uncommon to keep quite exotic pets, especially if you worked in an industry or a trade where you travelled, which Lucy's father does. He's a mercer. But at the moment, Joe doesn't know what that means. So if you're wondering and think you don't know what it means, fear not. Joe will find out, and then you will find out. And of course, there's this apprentice who's just coming back to the house now for lunch. He's the son of one of William Lucas's cousins. The cousins have died, and they've taken the son in, and William Lucas has arranged him an apprenticeship. And the son is really, really ungrateful. And of course, it turns out to be Tobias, who's just about to walk into the house. Chapter 3. Joe groaned inwardly. Of course, Tobias. He'd been bound to be here. It would be so lovely to be in Lucy's world one day without him. But he was always somewhere in the background, and every time he seemed to take an instant dislike to Joe. The front door opened. Up on the curtain rail, the monkey sat completely still, alert. "Solomon," said Peter in a warning voice. Already the monkey had leapt down from the rail and scampered out of the room. The next moment there was a shout from the passage. "Get off me, you filthy little beast! Get off!" Peter looked towards the door but didn't move. "Is he attacking Tobias?" Joe asked. Lucy's brother nodded. "If you knew he was going to do that, why didn't you catch him before Tobias came into the house?" Peter's eyes danced. Solomon just expresses what the rest of us feel. If we're going to be stuck with Tobias for 7 years, we may as well have some fun out of it. There was another yell from the passage. "That is disgusting! Oh, why do you always do that?" Then really loudly, "Peter!" Lucy's brother shrugged. "I suppose I better go and help." "What has Solomon done?" "He's just pooed on Tobias. He always does. I swear he waits. But he'll get nasty in a minute if I don't go and get him." He left the room. Joe stayed in his chair. Tempting though it was to go and have a look, he knew that the longer he could escape Tobias's notice, the easier it would be to stay in Lucy's world. A moment later, Lucy put her head around the door. "It's dinner time. Would you like to come and wash your hands?" Jo followed her out of the room and along the passage to the kitchen at the back of the house. It was clean and bright, with white walls, a scrubbed table, and flowers on the windowsill. The back door and windows stood open, looking out onto a small garden. It was still blazing hot, however, from the fire that burned beneath a cauldron. Ellen stood beside it, removing a chicken from a spit. "If this weather goes on much longer," she said, "we'll have to start taking things to the baker's to be cooked. The fire's too much on a day like today." At one end of the kitchen, the fair-haired girl was scouring a cooking pot, apparently using sand. Jo remembered the man he'd seen earlier with the barrel. Lucy showed Jo to a stone sink in the corner with a tap above it. "You have running water," Jo exclaimed. At once he was afraid he'd given himself away. Perhaps running water was normal in this new world. But she glowed with pride. "I know," she said. "We have a tank which is filled through the pipes 3 times a week." She put a bowl into the sink and turned on the tap. A stream of murky liquid came out. It smelled horrible, like a stagnant pond. Running water it might be, Jo thought, but not like at home. Lucy dipped her hands in the water and picked up a hard white block from the edge of the sink. "Is that soap?" Jo was sure he'd never seen soap in any of her previous worlds. She nodded. "It's from Castile." Again she sounded proud. "My father brings it back from Antwerp." "Don't use too much, though," she whispered. "It's much more expensive than the black stuff." Jo tried to imagine black soap. Didn't sound very likely to get anything clean, but given the colour and smell of the water, what Lucy thought of as clean might be quite different from what he expected. Peter followed them into the kitchen and washed his hands too. Solomon was nowhere to be seen. He must be back on his leash, Jo supposed. Lucy led the way out along the passageway and into a large room opposite the sitting room. The lower walls were panelled in wood, and there were brightly coloured tapestries above the panelling. Jo saw that a flap had been cut into one of them for a door. He pictured himself taking a pair of scissors to a tapestry in his own time. People would be horrified. It was dim in this room after the brightness of the kitchen. These windows, like the ones in the sitting room, looked out on the street. A long oak table stood in the middle of the room, spread with dishes. William and Ellen were already seated at either end, and the woman who'd passed through the hall earlier stood filleting a fish. Jo looked more closely. Wasn't this the woman who'd been cleaning the furs at Old Wardour? That was why she looked familiar. Ellen had mentioned someone called Mary, and this was Mary. He smiled inwardly. Maybe the girl, Elizabeth, had been a servant at Wardour too. He didn't remember her, but that didn't mean anything. There had been hundreds of servants there. He wondered whether anyone else would turn up. Morley, the steward, for example, or Peakes, the gatekeeper. Or what about Lucy's uncle and aunt? If people other than Lucy's close family were going to start turning up from one world to the next, he would eventually know everyone he met. For the first time ever, he wondered how long he would be able to keep coming back into Lucy's worlds. He pushed the question away. Now wasn't the time to think about it. Peter took his place beside Lucy, and Jo sat down on the other side of her. Mary sat opposite, leaving 2 empty chairs to either side. There was a 5th empty chair between Jo and Ellen, and a 6th between Peter and William. Jo wondered why the family had such an enormous table. Then he realised 3 of those chairs would have been for Matthew, Cecily and Anne. He felt abruptly sad to know that he wouldn't be seeing them this time, or ever again, probably. He hadn't been nearly as close to them as he was to Lucy, and even Peter, but they'd always been there, part of the fabric of Lucy's life. Meeting them in each new time had been reassuring. Elizabeth came into the room and sat down beside Mary. She was followed by an older boy. "All cleaned up, Tobias?" asked William, with just a shadow of a smile. "Yes, sir." Tobias scowled as he took his seat to the left of Lucy's father. Joe studied him covertly. His curly dark hair was longer this time than it had been before, spilling onto his shoulders. He was more plainly dressed than Peter and William, with square cuffs and a flat white collar showing over his grey jacket. There was not a frill to be seen. "Let's say grace, then." Everyone folded their hands. "Good Lord, bless us," said William, "and all thy gifts which we receive of thy bounteous liberality through Jesus Christ our Lord." "Amen," replied everyone. Joe peeped sideways with his head still bowed. At old Wardour the graces had been very long, but this seemed to be it. "Let's eat," Ellen said, "before it gets cold." She drew the roast chicken towards her and began to carve it. "Joe, pass me your plate." Joe handed her the metal dish that was in front of him. Although the chicken was not especially large, she gave him a generous amount of meat. "That's humble pie there," she said, pointing to a pastry oblong in front of William. Joe watched Lucy's father, wondering if he'd misheard. Had Ellen said humble pie? William, he saw, didn't take any of the pastry, nor did Tobias or Peter. Perhaps it wasn't edible. After Lucy had helped herself, Joe followed her example, using his spoon to put a little of the pie filling onto his plate. Whatever umble was, it didn't look very appetising. He helped himself to some of each of the other dishes as well. Besides the chicken, there was another plate of meat, and 2 types of fish. There was something with potato, and another dish that seemed to be oranges, lemons, and eggs. There were also 2 sweet dishes, which the family ate together with the savoury ones. Just like old Wardour, there were no forks on the table, so they ate with their fingers, using the bread to soak up the sauce. "You must be thirsty, Joe." Lucy's mother poured some liquid from a jug into Joe's cap. There. I nearly said Joe's cap. That would be a bit weird. Lucy's mother poured some liquid from a jug into Joe's cup. "Thank you, madam," he said. From the smell, he knew it was going to be beer. He took a sip. At least it was less bitter than the beer had been in Jorvik. But how was it, he wondered, that in Tudor times at old Wardour they had progressed to drinking water, even though they hadn't had running water indoors? Here there was a tap and a sink in the kitchen, but it was back to beer again. While they ate, the family talked of this and that, news from the neighbourhood, a disagreement between 2 of William's colleagues, and a pie filled with live blackbirds which had been served to the Dutch ambassador. "I heard it was snake pie," Peter said. "Well, either way, the ambassador was not amused," William said. "He doesn't seem to share the king's sense of fun." Everyone except Tobias laughed. "When I passed Whitehall this morning," William said, "there was a huge queue of people waiting for the king's touch." "I've heard it works better on a fast day," Ellen put in. "That's probably why there were so many." Seeing the blankness on Joe's face, she said, "You've not heard of this?" He shook his head. "If you're sick, you can go and be cured by the king. People come from far and wide. He cures thousands of people every year who are suffering from the king's evil." Joe weighed up whether or not to ask what the king's evil was. He decided to risk it. Ellen looked uncertainly at her husband. "It's an affliction that takes many forms," William said vaguely. "A lot of people have sores, but there was one little girl who'd been blinded by it. The king cured her just by touching her face." Around the table there were murmurs of admiration. Only Tobias was silent, his face stonier than ever. There was a good deal of food left when everyone had eaten as much as they wanted. Joe wondered if Ellen always prepared enough for unexpected guests, or whether she was still in the habit of catering for a larger family. He copied Lucy and the others, dipping his napkin in a cup of water and using it to clean his hands and then rub his teeth. It felt strange to do something as personal as cleaning his teeth at the table, but nobody else seemed at all embarrassed. "Shall we say grace?" William said. Joe put down his napkin and bowed his head once more. "The God of peace and love vouchsafe always to dwell with us, And thou, Lord, have mercy upon us. Glory, honour, and praise be to thee, God. This time the grace did go on and on. Joe let his thoughts drift. He felt impatient to speak to Lucy on her own, and frustrated at the thought that she would need time to get to know him again. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, William said at last. Amen, replied the family. Joe looked up to see what came next. Tobias's head was still bent, his lips moving silently. Mary and Elizabeth began to clear the dishes, and Lucy and Ellen rose to help them, while Peter and William remained at the table. Joe hesitated. At home, Mum and Dad expected him and Sam to help clear up, but this looked like an old-fashioned male-female division. He stayed in his chair, hoping he was doing the right thing. "What lessons do you have this afternoon?" William asked his son. "More Greek grammar," Peter answered, "and then a general assembly. 3 of us will be chosen to declaim in Latin on the book of Ecclesiastes." He made a face. "I just hope it's not me." Joe swallowed, praying he wouldn't have to go to school with Peter this time. He'd struggled enough with dictation when they'd had lessons together at Fishbourne, but at least he'd understood what he had to do. Nothing he'd learned at home would help him with what Peter was doing now. William nodded. "It'll be worth it in the end," he said to Peter. "Now, remember to take care as you walk back. Steer clear of any rough types." "Yes, sir." Peter got up and left. William turned to Joe. "If you'd like to stay with us for a while," he said, "I'll find out this afternoon whether I can arrange something to occupy you. Or do you have family elsewhere in the country?" "No, sir. I'd like to stay if that's okay. If that's all right." Joe corrected himself hastily. He'd looked up the word okay last year, and nobody had used it before Victorian times, and that had been in America, not England. He didn't yet know what year it was here, but he was sure it would be wrong. William looked at Joe thoughtfully. If he'd noticed Joe's slip of the tongue, he didn't comment. "Very good. I'll see what I can do. Tobias, are you ready?" Wordlessly, Tobias followed William out into the hallway and picked up his hat. William put his wig and his own hat back on, and they left the house together. Joe hovered in the hall, wondering what to do. "Don't hope for too much," Ellen said, coming out of the kitchen and shepherding Joe through to the sitting room, where she sat down at her embroidery frame again. "My husband managed to arrange an apprenticeship for Tobias, but with the way that's turning out, the Mercers might be reluctant to take his recommendation again." "But I don't want an apprenticeship," exclaimed Joe in alarm. Then, afraid that he sounded rude, he added, I don't want him to go to a lot of trouble on my account. I don't know how long I'll be here." He wished she knew how true this was. But Lucy's mother just smiled. "As far as I'm concerned," she said, "you can stay for as long as you like. It's too quiet around here these days, and Tobias hasn't done anything to improve that." "He's mean and selfish," Lucy said as she came into the room. "There are plenty who'd give anything to be able to afford an apprenticeship like that." "Your husband won't pay out any money on my account, will he?" Joe said. "No, don't worry about that," Ellen replied. "He's a lifelong member of the Company of Mercers, like his father and grandfather before him. Anything he arranges will be done on goodwill. But Lucy's right. They're some of the most sought-after apprenticeships in the land. People pay up to £1,000 for one." Joe saw shock on Lucy's face. Obviously she'd known it was a prized position, but not the actual cost. He wondered how much money £1,000 here would be in his own world. 100,000 maybe. He'd have to ask Dad. "Why is Tobias not happy?" he asked. "Because the Mercers stand for everything he's been brought up to hate." Ellen gestured to Joe to take a seat beside Lucy, who had picked up some sewing. Joe wondered again what a Mercer was. "What is it exactly that Tobias hates about the Mercers?" he asked, hoping this question might answer the other. "Tobias's parents were Puritans," Lucy said. "Didn't you realise from the way he dresses?" "The plain collar and cuffs, you mean? But he was wearing grey," Joe said. I thought they wore black. Ellen frowned. Maybe you've only known Puritans of high rank. It would be ostentatious for someone like Tobias to wear such an expensive colour. Joe bit his lip. He'd fallen into a trap of his own making, preoccupied with trying to guess what a mercer was, and pleased with himself for remembering something about the Puritans. Where had he got that idea from, about them wearing black? The Puritans had disapproved of anything that was fun, or any kind of decoration, he remembered. But it was more than that. Then he recalled a painting he'd seen of a Puritan family. They'd been all in black. Perhaps they'd been wearing their best clothes for the portrait. That made sense. Or perhaps they were rich. Now that he thought about it, he could see that you'd have to be rich to have your portrait painted. In any case, Ellen was saying, his parents taught him that luxury is a weakness. So you can imagine the mercers are the last company he would want to work for, as silk traders. Joe nodded. It was starting to fall into place now. Silk was obviously a luxury, so if a mercer was a silk merchant, and Tobias was a Puritan, of course he would disapprove of the company of mercers, and of William Lucas too, no doubt. Then why did he take the apprenticeship? He had no choice, Lucy's mother said. The plague turned London into a ghost town. Hundreds were dying every week, thousands even at its height. People fled the city or stayed indoors, either afraid to go out or locked up like us. You were locked up? For how long? Almost 3 months in total, until 4 weeks after Cecily died. Ellen broke off. That's how it was here, Lucy said quietly. Once one member of a family died, they painted a red cross on the door and the words "God have mercy," so people knew to stay away. They posted a watchman outside too, day and night, to make sure nobody came out. How did you get food? Joe asked, aghast. There were 2 kind families among the mercers, Lucy said. They gave food to the watchman for us, but then one of those families left town and the other was locked up like us. 4 of my children died of the plague, Ellen said. Matthew, Cecily, Anne and Francis. She cleared her throat. And we had so little to eat that my milk dried up, so baby Thomas died of starvation. There followed a long silence. At length Ellen said, I was telling you about Tobias, wasn't I? His father's business failed, with London deserted. Tobias's parents died bankrupt, so Tobias had to give up his place at the Inns of Court. But he hasn't forgotten that he once had a very different future than the one ahead of him now. He should be glad he's got any future at all, Lucy said, jabbing at her sewing. The world would be a dismal place if everyone moped around thinking about what might have been. Life goes on and the living have to go on with it, don't you think, Joe? Joe nodded mutely. He knew she was right, but he felt like a fraud agreeing with her. There was no way he would ever experience the kind of loss she'd known in this past year. She thought he understood. He cringed at the prospect of telling her he didn't. But even if he wanted to, there was nothing he could do to change the fact that he was just a visitor here. He'd always known he was unbelievably lucky to share a few hours of her life in all these different worlds. But it struck him now that he was luckier still to be able to go home. There we are. Yes, life in London during the plague. We've all been shut up, so 3 months. That's interesting for me to read that now, when it's been, March, 23rd of March, April, May. It's been 2.5 months for us so far, hasn't it? That we've all been asked to stay at home, and already people are starting to come out. But we're being asked to stay at home where most of us are all at home and safe and well, generally speaking. I mean, for some of you that may not be the case, and that's going to be really, really hard. But you can't imagine staying at home as one after another of your family members actually dies in the home, in the house, and you're locked up until 4 weeks after the last person has died, because obviously that's what they'd worked out was the safe time for the contagion to have passed through the family and taken anybody it was going to. Quite a prospect. Quite a prospect. And that was exactly the experience for a huge number of the people who were living in London in 1665. So that's the experience Lucy's had. And if Joe has the sense to know, think about his history, he will now know what year it is, because they said it was last year, and he should know that the plague was 1665. I hope some of you might have known that too. If you didn't, you do now. I will see you tomorrow for another instalment, Thursday, 5 o'clock, chapter 4. See you then. Have a good evening. Bye.